Before I tell you about the eagle, I have to tell you what kind of man finds an eagle and stops his truck. Because most men don't. Most men have somewhere to be, and a dying bird on the shoulder of a county road is just one more thing the world is letting go of while they keep their hands on the wheel. I want you to remember that as you read this. I want you to remember that the whole thing turned on a single decision that took my grandfather less than 4 seconds to make, and that he spent the rest of his life trying to understand why he made it. Because what that eagle led him to out past the dry wash, past the fence line nobody had mended in 30 years, was not what any of us expected. It changed our family. It is the reason I am the one telling you this and not someone else. So stay with me. Stay all the way to the end. Some stories only make sense once you know how they finish, and this is one of them. My name is Caleb Hartley, and I keep a logbook. I've kept one since I was 11, a habit my grandfather gave me the way other men give their grandsons pocket knives. Write down what you see, he told me, because your memory will lie to you to make you feel better, and the truth deserves a witness. I have 41 of those logbooks now, stacked in a cedar chest in the room that used to be his. The oldest one, the one from the summer I'm about to tell you about, has a brown water stain across the cover shaped like the state of Texas. I didn't plan that. Sometimes the world signs its own work, and you only notice years later. I should be honest with you from the start. I'm not a natural teller of this. I fidget when I talk about it. My wife says I tug at the cuff of my left sleeve when I get to the hard part, the same way my grandfather used to rub the scar on the back of his hand. We inherit the strangest things from the people we love, not their land or their money, but their nervous habits, their silences, the particular way they flinch. So if this comes out in fits and starts, that's why. I'm telling you a thing I've spent 40 years not quite telling anyone. The morning it started, I was 13, riding shotgun in my grandfather's '78 Ford, while the heat came up off the asphalt in those wavering sheets that make the distance look like it's underwater. We'd been out since before dawn checking the south tanks, because the drought that year had turned the whole county the color of old bone. You could smell it, the dust, and under the dust, a sweetness that was the grass dying. There's a particular perfume to a pasture giving up. People who didn't grow up on land don't believe me when I say you can smell death coming weeks before it arrives, but you can. It comes up out of the ground. Granddad, everyone called him Walt, drove with one wrist hooked over the top of the wheel and the radio off, which meant he was thinking. He thought a lot. He'd lost my grandmother 2 winters before, and grief had made him quiet in a way that wasn't sad exactly, more like a man who'd set down a heavy thing and was still feeling the shape of it in his hands. He'd catch himself sometimes reaching for the second coffee cup out of habit, the one that had been hers, and he'd stop with his hand halfway to the cupboard and just stand there. I never said anything when that happened. There are mercies that are made entirely of not speaking. I saw the eagle first. It was on the shoulder, down in the bar ditch, a hump of dark brown that I almost took for a blown tire until it moved. "Stop," I said, and then louder, "Granddad, stop. There's something," and he was already on the brake, the truck nosing down, gravel popping under the tires. We sat there a second with the engine ticking and the heat pressing in through the open windows. The thing in the ditch lifted its head, and I felt the whole morning go still, the way a room goes still when someone walks in carrying bad news. A golden eagle. I knew it the way you know a thing is rare even before you have the words for why. It was enormous, bigger than I'd imagined an eagle could be up close, with a wingspan that, even folded and broken, suggested something that belonged to the sky and not to a ditch beside Farm Road 218. One wing was wrong. It hung at an angle that made my stomach turn over slow, and there was blood, dark and crusted, matting the feathers along its breast. But the eyes, God, the eyes. They were the color of strong coffee held up to a window, lit from behind, and they fixed on us with a fury that had nothing to do with fear. That bird was not afraid of dying. It was furious about it. There's a difference, and I learned it that morning, 13 years old in the front seat of a Ford, and I have never unlearned it. Granddad got out slow. He had a way of moving around animals, this economy of motion, like he was trying not to spend any sudden gestures, like sudden gestures cost money he didn't have. "Don't," I said, because I'd read enough to know a raptor's talons could go through a leather glove like it was wet paper. He didn't answer. He crouched about 6 feet from the bird and just looked at it, the two of them taking each other's measure, and I swear something passed between them that I couldn't read and still can't. The eagle hissed, a sound like steam, like a kettle pulled off the fire and tried to spread its wings, and the broken one wouldn't go, and it screamed, and the scream did something to my grandfather's face that I'd only seen once before, at my grandmother's graveside. It cracked something. You could watch it happen. "Hand me the horse blanket," he said, "and the wire cutters, and don't argue with me, Caleb, we don't have all day." I should tell you here that my grandfather was 71 years old that summer, with a heart the doctors in Abilene had already warned him about, the kind of warning that comes with a little orange bottle and a lot of careful language. He had arthritis that made his hands curl up some mornings like dried leaves on the windowsill. He had no business wrestling a wild golden eagle in a bar ditch in 100-degree heat. He knew it. I knew it. And he did it anyway because that was the whole of who he was, distilled down into one stubborn act. I have spent a lot of years trying to be that kind of man and mostly failing, and I've come to think the failing is its own kind of inheritance, the kind that keeps you humble. It took us the better part of an hour. The eagle fought. Of course it fought, it didn't know we meant well, and even if it had known, I'm not sure it would have cared, because pride is not a thing that listens to reason. Granddad took a gash across the back of his hand that he'd carry as a scar for the rest of his life, a pale comma of raised skin he'd rub absently in church for years, during the long parts of the sermon, the way other men checked their watches. He got the blanket over the bird, talking the whole time in this low, even voice, not words exactly, just sound, the kind of sound you make to a spooked horse or a frightened child. "Easy now, easy, I got you. I got you, I got you." And slowly, this is the part I still don't fully believe, slowly the bird stopped fighting. Not because it had given up. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the whole rest of this story. It hadn't given up. You could feel it still coiled under the blanket, all that rage just held in suspension, like a fist that hasn't decided yet whether to open. It had decided somehow to let us, to allow it. There's a trust a wild animal extends that's more frightening than its violence, because you know exactly what it cost. You know it went against everything in the creature's blood, and you become responsible for it in a way you didn't ask to be. The moment that bird stopped fighting, my grandfather was bound to it. He'd have told you that himself. We laid it in the bed of the truck in a nest of feed sacks, and I rode the rest of the way home in the back with my hand resting an inch from its body, feeling the heat come off it, the impossible rapid hammer of a wild heart going like a clock that's been wound too tight. "Easy," I kept saying. "Easy, easy." I was 13 and I was crying a little, and I didn't care if Granddad saw, except he couldn't. He was driving, going slow now, slower than I'd ever seen him drive, taking the dips in the road gentle as a man carrying a bowl filled to the brim. Every cattle guard, he'd come almost to a stop. I have a lot of memories of my grandfather. That drive, the back of his neck, the careful way he took those dips, that's the one I'd keep if I could only keep one. The nearest vet who'd look at a wild raptor was a woman named Dr. Sandra Coyle, 2 counties over, who ran a rehabilitation operation out of a converted dairy barn. Granddad knew her the way ranchers know everybody, through some chain of favors and funerals and borrowed equipment stretching back decades. He called her from the kitchen phone with the eagle still out in the truck, and I listened to his half of it standing in the doorway. "Golden, adult. Wings broke, the right one, and she's been bleeding from the chest." A pause. "I don't know how long, found her this morning." Another pause longer, and then my grandfather, who did not ask anyone for anything, who would drive 40 miles on a bad spare rather than knock on a stranger's door, said a word I had almost never heard him say. He said, "Please." Just that, please. And I understood, hearing it, that this had stopped being about a bird. Dr. Coyle met us at her barn as the light was going amber, and long across the stubble fields. She was younger than I'd pictured, with forearms like a man's and a braid going gray at the temple, and she handled the eagle with a confidence that made my grandfather visibly relax for the first time all day, his shoulders coming down a full inch. She disappeared into a back room with the bird wrapped in our horse blanket. We waited on a bench that smelled of iodine and old hay and something animal underneath, and Granddad rubbed the fresh gash on his hand and stared at nothing. And I wrote in my logbook by the gray light coming through a dusty window. I still have that entry, the handwriting jumpy from the long day, and neither of us said out loud what we were both saying inside, which was the same 3 words over and over. Don't let it die. Don't let it die. After all that, please, don't let it die. She came out after dark and wiped her hands on a rag that had seen 100 animals' worse days. Well, she said, it's a clean break, which is the good news the wing'll set. I've pinned it. The chest wound superficial looks worse than it is. She probably caught a barbed wire fence going low after something. She lost blood and she's dehydrated and she's old, older than I'd like to see in a bird coming through trauma like this. She looked at my grandfather a long moment, reading him the way she'd read the bird. You did right bringing her. Most people would have driven on past, or worse, gone home for the shotgun and called it mercy. She paused and her voice flattened. We get both kinds out here. You'd be surprised which is more common. Will she fly again? Granddad asked. It was the only thing he wanted to know. Ask me in 6 weeks. On the drive home in the full dark with the windows down and the night air finally gone cool and kind, my grandfather said the thing that started everything that came after. He said, she came from somewhere, Caleb. Birds like that don't just turn up broke on a county road by accident. She's got a territory. She's gotta, he searched for the word, his hand opening and closing on the wheel, a place, a home range. Something put her in that ditch. He was quiet for a mile, the headlights pulling the fence posts out of the dark one by one. I'd sure like to know what. I want to pause here, because this is the hinge of the whole thing, the place where an ordinary good deed turned into something else. A reasonable man, having saved a dying eagle at the cost of a torn-up hand and a long, worried day, would have considered the account settled, would have gone home and slept the sleep of the righteous, and let the bird become a good story he told down at the feed store on Saturdays. But my grandfather was not, in this one specific way, a reasonable man. He had a curiosity in him that grief had sharpened rather than dulled. Since my grandmother died, he'd been a man quietly looking for something to need him, some problem only he could solve. And here was this bird, and the question of where it came from, and I think, I've turned this over for 40 years. I think he latched onto that question because it was a way of caring about something that could still be saved. He hadn't been able to save my grandmother. The cancer took 11 months and he'd been useless against every day of it. A strong man with strong hands and nothing to do with them but hold hers. Maybe he could save this. Maybe he could at least understand it. Maybe understanding was a kind of saving. Over the next 6 weeks, we drove out to Dr. Coyle's barn every Sunday after church, my grandfather in the same pressed shirt, the gash on his hand healing to a shine. The eagle Granddad never named her, said you don't name what you intend to set free, said nomming was a kind of keeping got stronger. The fierce coffee-colored eyes lost none of their fury, but the body under the feathers filled back out, the bones came back under her. By the 4th week she was standing. By the 5th she was beating that mended wing against the mesh of the flight cage, raising dust, screaming her steam kettle scream that bounced around the rafters, and Dr. Coyle smiled at the sound the way you'd smile at a baby's first wobbling steps. There's the girl, she'd say. There's the mean old girl. Good. In my logbook I called her Empress because she ruled that cage like a deposed queen waiting out her exile, certain it was temporary, certain the sky was still hers by right. And the whole time, my grandfather was working the other question. Where had she come from? He'd been a tracker in his younger days, had hunted these hills since before they were fenced and cross-fenced and sold off in pieces, and he started going out alone in the early mornings before the heat, walking the rough country north of where we'd found her, looking for sign. He came home dusty and thoughtful, his boots white with caliche. He'd spread his big county map out on the kitchen table at night under the hanging lamp and mark it with a stub of carpenter's pencil, circling washes and rock outcrops, and the few places high enough to matter, the old patient logic of a hunter narrowing a range down to its honest center. Golden's nest on cliffs, on ledges, someplace with a long view and a hard wind to launch off of, he told me, tapping the map with the pencil. There's only so many places north of here that fit. And she didn't fly far, broke up the way she was. She came down close to home. Stands to reason home's right about tap here. Why does it matter, Granddad? I asked him once on one of those nights because I was 13 and I wanted to know the rule, the way kids want a rule for everything. She's gonna be okay. Dr. Coyle's gonna turn her loose. Why's it matter where she used to live? He didn't answer right away. He was sitting in his chair by the window with his bad hand resting on the arm, that pale comma of a scar gone pink and permanent now. Outside, the windmill was turning slow in the last copper light, and the blades threw a moving shadow across his face, bright and dark and bright. Because something put her in that ditch, Caleb, he said at last. And things that hurt one thing usually hurt more than one thing. That's just how hurt works. It doesn't stop at the first body. Your grandmother used to say the world tells on itself if you'll just hold still long enough to listen. Hold still and pay attention and the world can't help confessing. He rubbed the scar with his thumb, slow. I've got a feeling is all. An old man's feeling, probably nothing. Probably I'm just an old fool looking for a reason to walk the hills again. He smiled a little. But it won't leave me be. It was not nothing. The day they released her, the whole thing changed. And I have to take a breath even now, all these years later, before I can set it down, because I can still see every part of it exactly, the way you can only see the days that split your life into a before and an after. Dr. Coyle said the eagle was ready, that to keep her any longer would do more harm than good, that a wild thing held too long forgets how to be wild, and that the kind thing, the only honest thing, was to take her back and open the box and let the sky have her again. Granddad asked if, instead of returning her to the ditch where we'd found her, we could release her up where he believed she'd come from, in the high country north of the Wash, near the red cliffs he'd been circling on his map for 6 weeks. Dr. Coyle thought about it, chewing the inside of her cheek, and said a bird like that would orient hard toward her home territory, that releasing her near it gave her the best odds of surviving the first hard winter, and that yes, all right, we'd do it his way. You've earned a say, she told him. Lord knows nobody else would've. So on a gray morning that finally promised the first rain in months, you could feel it in the air, that low-charged heaviness, the smell of distant water. The three of us drove a rutted ranch road as far as the old Ford would go, and then Granddad carried that crated eagle on foot another half-mile up a slope of caliche and cedar, breathing hard, sweat cutting clean, lines through the dust on his face, refusing my help with a short shake of his head every time I reached for the crate, until we came out onto a kind of bench of open land below a long red cliff with the whole dry county spread out behind us like a held breath. And Dr. Coyle knelt in the dirt and worked the latch and opened the crate. The eagle did not hesitate. There was no slow emergence, no testing of the air with one foot, no looking back. She exploded out of that box like something fired from a gun, 6 feet of wing cracking open all at once. And she rose so fast and so steep that it pulled a sound out of all three of us at the same time, a kind of gasp, an involuntary prayer with no words in it. And she caught the wind coming up the face of the cliff, and she went up and up in a tightening spiral, smaller and smaller, until she was a black mark against the gray, and then she was over the top of the rock and gone. And the sky was just empty sky again, and my grandfather was standing there with his hat in his hands, and the tears running openly down into the deep creases of his face, not wiping them, not ashamed of them, just letting them come. There, he said, so soft I barely caught it. There you go, girl, go on home. We should have left then. The story should have ended right there, clean and whole and good, a man, his grandson, A wild thing healed and returned to the air it was made for. If you wanted to paint a picture to hang on the wall, to put on the front of a calendar, that's the moment you choose, the old man and his hat and the empty, grateful sky. But my grandfather did not turn toward the truck. He was still looking up at the cliff where the eagle had vanished over the rim, and his face had changed, gone tight and strange and pale under the dust. The tears stopped midway down. "Sandra," he said, "you see that? Up there on the ledge, 2/3 of the way up. That dark spot." Dr. Coyle shaded her eyes with the flat of her hand. "The nest, most likely. Goldens reuse the same eyrie year after year, build it up taller every season till it's the size of a bathtub." "No," he said, and there was something new in his voice, something low and certain and afraid. "Not the nest. Below the nest, that." And he started toward the base of the cliff at a pace that frightened me badly. An old man with a worn-out heart moving fast over loose rock, toward something he had seen and I had not. And I scrambled up after him, calling his name. "Granddad, Granddad, wait," and Dr. Coyle came too. And the first fat drops of the long-awaited rain began to fall, ticking against the cedar and darkening the red stone in spreading coins. And the smell of wet dust rose up around us thick and sudden. That smell every dry country child knows, the smell of relief, of the world being given back something it had been missing. And what we found at the base of that red cliff, half hidden in the cedar and the falling rain, is the reason I have never once been able to tell this story all the way through in a single sitting. It is the reason my hand goes to my sleeve. It is the reason I am going to have to stop here and gather myself and let the rain fall a while in my memory before I can tell you the rest of it. Stay with me. I know it's hard to wait. The hardest part is still ahead, and you'll want to have your feet under you when we get there. If you're coming to this cold, go back and read the first part, because what I'm about to tell you won't land right without it. And if you've already been with me, if you waited, then I want you to do one thing before we go up to that cliff together. I want you to picture my grandfather, 71, hat in his hands, watching the eagle he saved disappear over the rim of red rock. Hold that picture, because it's the last moment in this whole story when he was only a man who'd done a good thing. Everything after the next paragraph he carried for the rest of his life. I carried it too. By the end of this part, you'll understand why a wounded bird is the smallest thing in a story that has its name on the title, and why my grandfather always said the eagle didn't lead us to a tragedy. It led us to the only people who could still be helped. Stay close. This is the part that matters. The rain was coming harder by the time I caught up to him at the base of the cliff. Not a downpour yet. That big country rain takes its time arriving, like it's deciding whether we deserve it, but steady now, fat warm drops smacking the cedar and running off the brim of my grandfather's hat in a thin curtain. He had stopped at the edge of a thicket of scrub, and he was looking down at something, and he had gone completely still in a way that I had learned, by 13, to be afraid of. My grandfather's stillness was never empty. It was always full of something he hadn't said yet. "Granddad." He put his arm out without looking at me, the flat of his hand against my chest, the universal sign for stop, stay back, let me. "Caleb," he said, very quietly, very evenly, in a voice scrubbed clean of everything but control. "I want you to walk back down to Sandra and tell her to bring her kit, the big one, and the blankets out of the truck. A beat. And then I want you to wait by the truck." "What is it, Granddad, what?" "Go on, son, right now. Don't run, the rock's slick, but go." I did not wait by the truck. I want to be honest about that, because this whole logbook of mine, this whole life of writing down what I saw, is built on the promise of honesty, and the truth is I was 13 and terrified, and I disobeyed him. I went and got Dr. Coyle, who took one look at my grandfather's face from 40 yards off and started moving fast, grabbing the orange kit and a bundle of blankets, and I followed her back up, my heart going like the eagle's had gone under my hand, and I came up behind a cedar just as she reached him, and I saw what he had seen, and the bottom fell out of the world. There were 2 of them. In a shallow undercut at the base of the cliff, a kind of low rock shelter half screened by the scrub, 2 children were huddled together in the dirt. a boy and a girl. The boy was maybe 10, the girl younger, 6 or 7, and they were thin in a way that I had never seen a person be thin, thin like the cattle got at the worst of the drought, the skin pulled tight over the architecture underneath. They were filthy, their clothes gone to rags the color of the dirt they sat in. The girl was asleep or unconscious against the boy's shoulder. The boy was not asleep. The boy was staring at my grandfather with eyes that held the exact same expression I had seen in the ditch 6 weeks before, not fear. Fury. The fury of something that has decided it will not be afraid, because being afraid is a thing you can't afford anymore. He had a rock in his fist, a good sharp piece of caliche the size of a hen's egg, and he had it cocked back, and he was putting his own starved body between this stranger and his sister. "Hey now," my grandfather said, and he sank down slow, all that economy of motion, the same way he'd gone down in the ditch, spending no sudden gestures. "Hey now, partner, easy, 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 I'm not gonna hurt her, I'm not gonna hurt either one of you." He set his hat down in the dirt, crown down, the way a man does when he's settling in to stay, and he showed the boy his open hands, the scar pale across the back of the right one. "See? Nothing, I got nothing. Just an old man with a busted hand." The boy did not lower the rock. His voice, when it came, was a cracked, dry rasp, a voice that had gone a long time without enough water to make words easy. "You can't have her." "No, sir," my grandfather agreed gently, like they were settling a fair price on a horse. "I sure can't. She's yours. Anybody can see that. I wouldn't dream of it." The rain ran down his face. He didn't wipe it. "What's her name, partner?" A long silence. The rock trembled in the boy's fist, not from fear, I understood later, but from simple weakness, from the effort of holding even that small weight at the end of however many days it had been. "Maria," the boy said finally. "She's Maria. His throat worked. "I'm Diego." "Diego," my grandfather repeated, like the name was something precious he was being trusted to hold. "Diego, that's a good strong name. I'm Walt. That lady coming up behind you real slow, that's Sandra. She's a doctor. She fixes things that are hurt. She fixed a bird for me, a big golden eagle. You maybe seen her, lives up on this cliff. We just now let her go right over your heads." He was talking the way he'd talked to the eagle, the low, even river of it, the words almost beside the point being the sound, the point being I am calm so you can be calm. "Diego, when's the last time you and Maria had something to eat?" The boy's face did a thing I have never been able to forget, and have never tried very hard to. It held the fury one more second, and then it broke, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly but goes all at once, and his face crumpled into the face of the child he actually was, 10 years old, exhausted past the end of himself, and the rock dropped out of his hand into the mud, and he said in a small voice that had finally run out of everything, "I couldn't find any more water. I've been giving her mine. I told her I wasn't thirsty, but I was lying. I've been lying to her for days." "And then, is she gonna die? Please, please don't let her die." The same 3 words. The same exact prayer we'd been praying in the vet's barn 6 weeks before. "Don't let her die." I tell you, I have turned that over 10,000 times, the symmetry of it, and I have never decided whether the world is cruel or kind to rhyme like that, to make us beg the same beggar's prayer for a bird and then for a child, but I have decided this much. My grandfather heard it. He heard the rhyme. I watched it land on him. What happened next happened fast, and I'll tell it fast because that's how it lives in me. Dr. Coyle was already on her knees beside the little girl, 2 fingers at her throat, her doctor's calm clamped down hard over something else, and she said, "She's alive. Tachycardic, she's badly dehydrated, we need fluids in her now," and she had a bag out of the orange kit, the kind of squeeze pouch she kept for dogs and once, she told us later, a fawn. "Diego, Diego, look at me, honey. I'm going to help Maria drink. I need you to help me. Can you help me?" And the boy, who would not be moved by a threat, was moved instantly by a job, by being needed, and he scrambled over and held his sister's head in his 2 filthy hands as gentle as my grandfather had taken the dips in the road, and the 3 of them got water into that little girl drop by careful drop, while the rain came down and my grandfather knelt in the mud with his hat off and his hand on the boy's shaking back. I stood by the cedar and I did the only thing I knew how to do, the thing my grandfather had trained into me. I witnessed. I have the logbook still. The entry from that afternoon is barely legible, the ink run with rain, but I can read it because I don't need to. 2 kids under the cliff. Boy named Diego. Girl named Maria. Eagle led us here. They are starving. We are too late and we are just in time, both at once. I did not know at 13 that you could be both at once. I know it now. I've been both at once 100 times since. It is the truest condition of being alive. We got them down the slope as the rain reached its full fury. My grandfather carrying the little girl against his chest the way he'd carried the crated eagle. Dr. Coyle half carrying the boy. Me running ahead to throw open the truck doors and lay down the blankets. And in the cab of that '78 Ford with the rain hammering the roof like the whole sky had finally let go all at once, with the heater running and 2 starved children wrapped in horse blankets, and Dr. Coyle's voice low on the radio calling ahead to the hospital in town. Diego told us, in pieces, in that cracked rasp, the shape of how they'd come to be under that cliff. And it was worse than starvation. Starvation was just the part we could see. I'm not going to give you all of it, because some of it isn't mine to give, and because Diego is a grown man now with a family of his own and a life he built out of the far side of this, and he gets to decide what of his own worst days goes into the world. But I'll give you the shape, because you've come this far and you've earned the shape of it. The children had crossed up out of the south, the 2 of them and their mother with a group, with men who'd been paid to bring them to people who were waiting for them, an aunt in a city up north, a phone number sewn into the hem of Maria's dress. Somewhere in the empty country something had gone wrong. Diego used the word left. The men left. He didn't have a more complicated word for it, and he didn't need one. The men took what the family had and they left them walking, and the mother. The mother had given out, days back. Diego didn't have soft language for that either. He said his mother lay down and told them to keep walking toward the high rocks because there'd be water in the shade of high rocks, and to wait there, and that she'd catch up when she'd rested. And the boy, 10 years old, had understood, in the way children understand the things adults try to wrap in mercy, exactly what his mother was telling him. He'd taken his sister's hand and he'd walked her to the high rocks his mother pointed at, the red cliff you could see for miles, the one with the eagle's nest 2/3 of the way up. And he'd kept her alive there for he didn't know how many days, giving her his water, telling her he wasn't thirsty, watching the sky. There was a big bird, Diego said, in the cab of the truck with the rain coming down. On the rock, she had a hurt wing, she couldn't go up. She stayed up there with us. I thought he stopped. He was 10 and he was trying to say something almost too big for the words he had. I thought she was watching us. I thought somebody sent her to watch us. I told Maria, see, somebody knows we're here, that bird knows, she's gonna tell somebody. His face did the thing again, the crumpling. I was just saying it so Maria wouldn't be scared. I didn't think it was true. My grandfather had to look out the window for a minute after that. His jaw was working. When he could talk again, he said, very rough, "It was true, son, it was true. She did tell somebody, she told me." And it might have been the only lie I ever heard my grandfather speak, or it might have been the truest thing he ever said, and I have spent 40 years unable to decide which, and I have come to believe that the inability to decide is the entire point, is the whole of what that afternoon under the cliff had to teach. Some things are a lie and the truth in the same breath. The bird had a broken wing and could not have meant anything by staying. The bird stayed and the children lived and we came. Both. At once. Always both at once. I want to stop the fast telling for a moment and slow down on one thing, because it's the thing I think about most. While Dr. Coyle worked on the girl and my grandfather steadied the boy, there came a point where Diego, holding his sister's head, lifted his eyes from her face and looked at the open hands again, the scarred one, and asked my grandfather a question that had clearly been building in him through every careful word. He asked, "Why'd you come up here?" Not suspicious anymore. Just needing to know, needing the world to make some kind of sense after it had stopped making any. And my grandfather, who could have said 100 easy comforting things, told him the plain truth instead, because he believed even a starving child deserved the truth and could carry it. He said, I came up here because I let a bird go and I happened to look down. That's all. There's no reason in it, son. I'm not anybody special and nobody sent me, and I can't tell you why it was me that looked or why it was today. I only know I did and it was. Sometimes that's all the answer there is, and you got to take it and go on. And the boy looked at him a long moment and then nodded slow, like a much older person, like that answer was somehow more bearable than a miracle would have been. I have never forgotten that nod. A child that age agreeing that the world is mostly accident, and you take the mercy where it falls. It broke me a little, and it has held me up ever since. There's a detail I left out of the rain, and I left it out on purpose, to give it to you here where you'd feel it. When my grandfather first knelt down and set his hat in the dirt, before any of the talking worked, before Diego dropped the rock, the eagle came back. Not all the way down. But she came off the top of the cliff and she cut one long slow circle out over the bench of land, low, close, that 6-foot shadow sliding over all of us in the rain. And she gave one cry, that steam kettle scream gone wild and open now that she was in her own sky. And then she rose again and was gone for good. Dr. Coyle says it was nothing, that a released bird circles its territory to reclaim it, that it had nothing to do with us. My grandfather never argued the point with her. He just didn't believe her, and neither, God help me, do I was there. I saw the boy's face turn up to that cry. I saw something in him decide to live in that exact second. You can call it whatever you need to call it. I call it the bird keeping her promise to a 10-year-old who only made it up to keep his sister from crying. They found the mother 2 days later. I'll say only that they found her, and that she was where Diego said, and that my grandfather paid for what came after, quietly, the way he did everything. So that she did not go into the ground a stranger with no name and no marker, the way the desert takes so many and tells no one. He drove out and stood at the burial with his hat in his hands the same as he'd stood watching the eagle fly, and he did not know her, and he wept for her like he had. I asked him later, much later, when I was old enough to ask hard questions, why he'd cried so for a woman he never met. And he said, she walked her bobbies to the one place in 50 miles where somebody would find them, Caleb, and then she made herself keep walking past her own strength so there'd be more water for them. And she lay down knowing she'd never get up, trusting a piece of rock and a hurt bird and a God she couldn't see to do the rest. That's not a stranger. That's the bravest soul I ever crossed paths with. I'd have been proud to know her. I cry for her because somebody ought to, and I'm the one that got to. That was the discovery the eagle led us to. Not a body, though there was a body, and the grief of it has never fully left me. The thought of that mother in the open country making the math of how to spend her last days, so they bought her children the most hours. The discovery was the children, living. The discovery was Diego with his rock, putting his ruined little body between his sister and the world one more time, having decided he would die before he'd be afraid. The discovery was that we were, by some accounting too fine for me to follow, exactly on time. One more day, Dr. Coyle told us flatly in the hospital hallway, maybe 2 for the boy. The girl had hours. We let an eagle go on the one gray morning the rain was coming and she rose up over a cliff and my grandfather happened to glance below her nest, and that was the whole margin. That was all the room the world left. Hours. In the hospital waiting room that night, while they put fluid and warmth back into 2 children up the hall, my grandfather sat with his hat on his knee and his scarred hand shaking just slightly. And he said something I wrote down that night and have read at his funeral, and at my own daughter's christening and to myself on the nights, I can't find the point of anything. He said, all these years I thought I was a man who stopped for a hurt bird. Turns out I was a man who got led to 2 kids in the dirt and the bird was just how the leading got done. He turned his hat in his hands. We don't ever know what we're really doing, son. We think we're saving the small thing. The small thing is saving us right back and pointing the whole time at something bigger we'd never have looked at on our own. You remember that. You write that down. I wrote it down. I'm writing it down again now for you. There's a thing that happened in that hospital that I have to put in, because if I don't, You'll think this was a story where everyone simply did the right thing and it was easy and clean, and nothing about it was easy or clean. Late that first night, a woman came to talk to us, county, official, kind enough but tired in the way of people who handle the worst days for a living and have run low on the part of themselves that used to flinch. She explained gently what the process would be, where the children would go, the system that existed to catch children with no family that anyone could reach, the aunt up north just a phone number sewn in a hem, unverified, maybe real, maybe gone. She used careful, soft official words, and underneath the words was a simple fact. The children would be taken somewhere, separated possibly, processed certainly, and my grandfather and Dr. Coyle and I were strangers who'd done our good deed and could go home now with the warm feeling of it. And I watched my grandfather listen to all of it with his hat on his knee, nodding politely, and I watched the moment he decided he would not let it go the way it was supposed to go. I didn't have a name for that look yet. I'd seen it twice now, at the ditch, at the cliff. The look of a man deciding to make something his problem that the world had decided was nobody's. "Ma'am," he said when she'd finished, "I hear you. You're doing your job and you're doing it kind, and I'm grateful. But that boy held his sister's life in his two hands under a rock for the better part of a week, and he didn't let go, and I'll be damned, pardon me, I'll be switched if I'm going to be the next thing in his life that comes along and leaves. So you tell me what a man has to do. You tell me what papers, what county, what judge, what hoops. I'm 71 and I got a bad heart in a paid-off place and nobody left to spend my days on. You tell me what I do, and I'll do every bit of it and I won't quit, and you can write that down somewhere, it counts." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she set down her clipboard and she stopped being official, and she said quietly, "It's not simple, Mr. Hartley. It's a hard road and it's a long one, and most people who say that tonight don't mean it by morning." And my grandfather said, "Then I'll be the one that means it. Won't be the first time I outlasted a thing just by refusing to quit it." But that's getting ahead. That's the next part. That night I only knew that the man I'd ridden into that morning to check stock tanks had become, somewhere between the ditch 6 weeks back and the cliff that afternoon, a man building towards something enormous, and that I was going to get to watch him do it, and that I would be writing it down the whole way. But I haven't told you the rest, because saving a child from a cliff is one afternoon, and what comes after, the weeks, the years, the question of what two grieving strangers and a starved boy and his sister actually become to each other once the rain stops and the hospital releases them, and the world goes back to expecting things of everybody, that's not an afternoon. That's the part nobody tells you. That's where the real story was hiding all along. And that's the part I have to tell you next. The eagle came back, by the way. That's how the last part starts. 3 weeks later she came back, and she was not alone, and what my grandfather did then is the reason I've spent my whole life trying to deserve the name he gave me. Stay with me a little longer. We're almost home. This is the last part, and it's the one I almost didn't write because endings are where we lie the most. We round things off. We make the dead wiser than they were and the hard years shorter than they felt. I promised my grandfather a long time ago that I'd keep an honest witness, so I'm going to try to give you the true ending instead of the pretty one. And the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect when I sat down, is that the true one is better. It's harder and it's better. By the end of this you'll know what happened to Diego and Maria, and to my grandfather and to the eagle, and you'll know why a man named Caleb is writing all this down at all. You'll know the heartbreak in the title was never only the mother under the open sky. There was a second heartbreak, a quieter one, and it's the one that made me who I am. Stay with me to the last line. I cut the very last thing he said to me out of every version of this I've ever told, but I'm going to give it to you. You waited. You earned it. The eagle came back 3 weeks after we let her go. It was an ordinary evening, the drought finally broken, the pastures going that unreasonable shocking green that dry country does after rain, like the land's showing off, like it wants you to forget how cruel it was a month ago. I was on the porch with my logbook. Granddad was in the yard doing something to the windmill with a wrench. And a shadow went over the both of us, big and slow, and we looked up at the same time. And there she was, that unmistakable 6-foot span, that flat soaring patience, turning a wide circle over the home place. We knew her. You don't forget a bird you carried in the bed of your truck with your hand an inch from her heart. Granddad took off his hat. He always took off his hat for her, the whole rest of his life, every time, the way some men do for a flag or a hearse. And she was not alone. A second eagle flew with her, smaller, younger, its plumage still carrying the white patches that Goldens wear before they come fully into their dark adult selves. "Well, I'll be," Granddad said softly, his face tipped up to the sky and the wrench forgotten in his hand. She found somebody, or she had somebody all along, and went back to him. He watched the two of them turn together, riding the warm evening air coming up off the green. Either way, she's not by herself up there. That's something, that's a good thing to know. I didn't understand, at 13, why his voice broke a little saying it. I understand now. He wasn't only talking about the bird. He'd spent 2 winters being a man by himself in a house that used to have 2 people in it. And he just spent 3 weeks turning his whole stubborn life inside out to make sure 2 orphaned children would never, be by themselves in the world. The eagle came back with somebody, and it landed on him like a benediction, like the universe confirming the thing he'd bet everything on, that nobody's supposed to be up there alone. That you go back for your somebody, or you find a new one, or you make one out of strangers and grief, and a long hard road through the county courts. But you do not, if you can help it, leave anyone alone against the sky. Because here is what my grandfather did in the weeks and months after the cliff, and I'm going to tell it plainly because plainly is the only way it doesn't sound made up. He kept his word to the tired woman with the clipboard. He did every single thing. He drove the 2 hours to the county seat so many times that the clerks knew his coffee order. He sat through hearings in a suit that smelled of mothballs, his hat on his knee, his scarred hand folded over his good one. He paid for a lawyer out of money he'd been saving for nothing in particular, which I came to understand is what he'd been saving it for all along. He just hadn't met the reason yet. The Ann up north turned out to be real but unwilling, frightened in her own kind of trouble, unable to take on 2 more mouths, and I will not judge her, and my grandfather wouldn't let me judge her either. "Everybody's carrying something you can't see the weight of," he said. "You don't get to decide how heavy another person's load is." So that door closed gently, and another road opened, the long one, the one the woman had warned him most people don't mean by morning. He meant it by morning. He meant it every morning. I want to tell you about the hard middle of those 14 months, because the hard middle is where most people's good intentions quietly die, and I think you should see how close his came to dying too, so that you understand it was a choice and not a fairy tale. There was a stretch around the 8th month where it looked like it would all fall apart. A new caseworker came on, by the book, suspicious of an elderly widower with a heart condition wanting to take in 2 children who'd come up across the border, and she was not wrong to ask the questions she asked. Those questions exist to protect children, and most of the time they're the only thing standing between a child and someone who means them harm. But they fell on my grandfather like accusations, and I watched them age him. There was an evening he came home from the county seat gray in the face and sat in his truck in the yard for a long time before he came in, and when he came in he didn't eat, and he sat down heavy in his chair by the window and said, to no one, to the windmill, "Maybe they're right. Maybe an old man's no kind of place to put 2 kids who have already lost everything. Maybe I'm being selfish, calling it love." And it was the only time in my life I heard my grandfather doubt the thing in front of him. It was Diego who answered him, though he wasn't supposed to be listening, 11 years old in the hallway in his socks. He came into the room and stood there and said, "You're not a place, you're Walt, that's all. You're not a place, you're Walt." And he turned around and went back to bed. And my grandfather sat very still for a minute, and then he got up and ate his cold supper standing at the counter, and the next morning he put on the mothball suit and drove the 2 hours, and he never wavered out loud again. I asked him once, years later, what that boy had meant. He said, "He meant I'd been thinking of myself as a thing the county was deciding about. A house, a bank account, a bad heart, a list of qualifications. And that boy reminded me I was a person who'd already shown up. You can't qualify your way into a child's life, Caleb. You can only show up and keep showing up until showing up is just who you are to them. That's the only credential that's ever counted for anything. Dr. Coyle stood up for him, too. I should say that because she's woven through this whole thing and I don't want her to vanish from the end of it. She wrote letters. She drove to the hearings. She testified, this no-nonsense woman with forearms like a man's, that she had watched my grandfather rehabilitate a wild creature with more patience and tenderness than she'd seen in 30 years of doing it professionally, and that if the county wanted to know what kind of home these children would have, they need only look at how the man had treated a bird that couldn't even thank him. He didn't do it for credit, she told the court. There wasn't any credit in it. A bird can't write a thank you note. He did it because a hurt thing was in front of him. That's the whole man. That's all you need to know about where those children ought to go. She and Granddad stayed friends to the end. She came to the funeral. She's the one who told me gently to be careful what I needed the eagle to mean, and she's also the one who, at the graveside, looked up when the shadow passed over and went quiet and didn't say a scientific word about it. I noticed. I write down what I see. It took 14 months. 14 months of a 71-year-old man with a bad heart driving bad roads to fight a slow system for two children who were not his by any blood or border. And at the end of it, Diego and Maria came to live on the home place for good, in the room that had been my grandmother's sewing room, which Granddad painted himself badly, a color Maria picked that was somewhere between yellow and the inside of a peach. I was there the day it became final. I wrote down what the judge said, and I wrote down that Granddad shook the judge's hand, and then had to turn around and put his own hand over his face, and I wrote down that Diego, who was 11 by then, and had not let anyone see him cry since the cliff, walked over and put his arms around my grandfather's middle and held on, and that the two of them stood like that in the courthouse hallway not saying anything, because the thing between them had gone way past anything words were any good for. They became my family. I need you to sit with the size of that, because the story could have been about a heroic rescue and stopped at the hospital doors, and most stories do, and that's the lie I told you I'd try not to tell. The real story isn't the rescue. The real story is the 14 months, and then the years. Maria grew up calling my grandfather abuelo and calling me her cousin, and she was right. She is my cousin. The papers just took a while to agree with the truth. Diego grew up tall and quiet and unbreakably steady, a boy who'd held the line under a rock and never quite stopped holding lines for people. And he is the finest man I know. And when he stood up at my grandfather's funeral and tried to speak and couldn't, the whole church waited as long as he needed, because everyone there knew what that boy had carried and what my grandfather had carried, and how the two of them had carried it the rest of the way together. Let me give you the small things from those 4 years, because the big things are easy to say, and the small things are where a life actually happens. Maria was afraid of the dark for a long time, which surprised no one, and my grandfather did not tell her there was nothing to be afraid of, because he didn't lie to children. Instead, he taught her the names of the stars out the window of the peach-colored room, the few he knew and a few I'm fairly sure he invented, until the dark became a thing with familiar furniture in it, a place she could find her way around. She'd recite them back to him at bedtime like a prayer. He'd correct her gravely on the ones he'd made up, as if they were gospel. There was a particular bright one low in the east that he called, with a completely straight face, the eagle's eye, and Maria believed in the eagle's eye until she was old enough to look it up and find it was Venus, and she came storming out to tell him he was a liar, and he said, "It's an eye and it watches over you and it's the brightest thing in the morning sky. I never said it was a star. You assumed." And she laughed so hard she forgot to be mad, which I am certain was the entire point. Diego, he handled differently, because Diego didn't need the dark made friendly. Diego needed to be allowed to be a child again after being a parent at 10, and you cannot order a boy like that to relax. You can only make a space safe enough that he sets the weight down on his own. So Granddad gave him jobs. Real ones, ones that mattered, the windmill and the south tanks, and eventually the slow, careful driving of the truck. And in the giving of real work to a boy who'd only known the work of survival, something healed that no amount of telling him it's over could have reached. The first time Diego laughed, really laughed. A kid's helpless laugh was over something stupid, a calf that sat down in a stock tank and looked personally offended about it. And I watched my grandfather watch that laugh with an expression I can only describe as a man receiving the thing he'd worked 14 months and 4 years and one broken eagle to receive. He didn't say anything. He just took his hat off, the way he did for the eagle, and held it against his chest a second and put it back on. Now I have to tell you the second heartbreak, the quiet one, the one the title doesn't warn you about because I didn't know how to fit it in a title. My grandfather did not get many years. I think part of me believed, the way children do, that a man who had done a thing that big would be paid back in time, would be granted a long, bright old age as a kind of reward, because the child's arithmetic insists that goodness and outcome have to balance. The world's arithmetic is different and it does not show its work. His heart gave out 4 years after the cliff, on an ordinary morning in the yard near the windmill, and I have always been bitterly and privately grateful that it was quick, and that it was outside under the open sky he loved, and that he got 4 years, 4 whole years of those kids at his table, of Maria's terrible peach-colored paint, of Diego learning to drive the truck slow over the cattle guards exactly the way Granddad had taught him, gentle as a man carrying water. 4 years is not enough. 4 years is everything, both, at once, always both at once. He taught me that under the cliff and then he made me live it. He knew it was coming toward the end, the way men with warned-about hearts come to know. And he did the thing he'd always done, the thing he gave me when I was 11. He set his accounts in plain order and he made sure the truth had a witness. He called me out to the porch one evening that last spring, just the two of us, the kids inside, the light going long and gold across the green, and he had me bring my logbook, the current one, and a pen. "I want you to write something down," he said. "And I want you to keep it, and someday I want you to give it to somebody who needs it, because a thing like this isn't yours to keep. It's only yours to carry a while and hand on." And then he told me slow, making sure I got it word for word, the thing I have carried 36 years and am only now handing on, to you because you waited, because you stayed, because somewhere in the reading of this you became the somebody who needed it. He said, "Caleb, I picked up a hurt bird off the side of the road because your grandmother taught me you stop for the hurt thing. You always stop, even when you've got somewhere to be, especially then. I thought that's all I was doing. I thought I was being kind to a bird. But the bird was carrying 2 children on her broken wing the whole time, and I couldn't see it. And that's the truest thing I know about a good life, son, so write it down careful. You will almost never get to see the whole of what your kindness is actually for. You do the small right thing in front of you, the only thing you can reach, and you trust that it's pointing at something bigger than you'll ever be shown. Most folks won't stop for the bird because they can't see the children, and you can never see the children. That's the whole trick of it. The children are always hidden under the cliff. So you stop for the bird, every time. You stop for the bird on faith. That's the entire instruction. That's everything I've got to give you. The rest is just weather." He died 11 days later. I was the one who found him in the yard, his hat fallen in the new grass. And I have never told anyone this part. I cut it out of every telling, it was too much mine. When I knelt down beside him in that green spring grass with my heart coming apart, there was a shadow, and a slow turning span, and a single cry, that steam kettle scream gone wild and high and open. And I looked up and an eagle was circling the home place, low, close, the way she'd come back the evening she brought her mate, the way she'd cut that one slow circle over the children in the rain. I do not know if it was her. Dr. Coyle would tell me a wild golden lives 20, 30 years, that it could easily have been the same bird, and that it also could have been any eagle, that the country was full of them again now that the drought had broken, and that I should be careful what I needed it to mean. I've been careful. I have been careful for 36 years. And I have decided with all the care in me, the same thing my grandfather decided about whether the bird meant anything by staying on the cliff with two starving children, that it is a lie and the truth in the same breath, and that the inability to choose between them is not a failure of understanding but the very deepest understanding there is. The bird could not have known. The bird came anyway. The children lived. The man who stopped for her lies in the ground under that green now, beside my grandmother, and his children grew up whole, and his name got handed down. And an eagle cried over him when he went, and I will go to my own grave refusing to say for certain whether the sky was speaking or only being the sky. I named my daughter Walt's middle name, which was Rain. His mother spelled it strange with an I, and I kept the spelling. Rain Hartley. She is 9 now. Last spring I started teaching her to keep a logbook. Write down what you see, I told her, because your memory will lie to you to make you feel better and the truth deserves a witness. She rolled her eyes at me, which is exactly right, which is exactly what I'd have done. But she keeps the book. I've peeked. Her spelling is its own kind of disaster, and her observations stopped my heart. 2 weeks ago she wrote, in her wandering 9-year-old hand, Dad cries when he talks about Abuelo Walt, but it is a happy cry and a sad cry at the same time. I asked how that works. He said that is the only true kind. You'll want to know what became of Diego and Maria, the real ending of the people and not just the man, and you deserve to know. Diego runs the home place now. He stayed. He could have gone anywhere. He's that capable, that steady. And he chose the land and the windmill and the slow truck over the cattle guards. And he raises his own children there, in a house with the peach-colored room repainted by now, but the strange star names still in use at bedtime. Handed down. The eagle's eye still watching over a new generation that hasn't looked it up yet. He drove 4 hours each way to be at my wedding, and he stood where a brother stands. When my father, my own father, that's a longer story and a sadder one, didn't come, Diego was the one who put his hand on my shoulder before I walked out and said the thing a father says. He learned how to be that from a 71-year-old cowboy who learned it from a hurt bird. The instruction passes down. That's the whole hope of the thing. Maria became a nurse. Of course she did. The girl who was carried out from under a cliff with hours left in her spends her days now putting fluid and warmth back into people the world has run low on, and she has never once, to my knowledge, said anything as on the nose as that out loud, because she doesn't need to, because she just goes and does it, shift after shift, the way my grandfather just went and did the thing in front of him. She has Maria's mother's photograph, the only one that survived, found later water-stained, a young woman squinting into hard light with a baby on her hip, framed on her wall beside her nursing license, the dead mother and the saved daughters calling hung side by side, and she lights a candle on the day they found her every year, and Diego drives down and they sit together and they don't say much. I've been twice. You don't say much. You just witness. They learned that from the same old man I did. So that's the story. A cowboy picked up a wounded eagle, and it led him to a heartbreaking discovery, and the discovery broke his heart twice. Once for a brave woman alone under the open sky, and once, years later, when the rest of us stood in a green yard and learned that the men who stop for the hurt thing don't get kept any longer than anyone else. They just spend the time they get more bravely. He stopped for the bird. He stopped for the children the bird was hiding. He stopped for 2 grieving strangers with no claim on him and made them his. And he stopped, in the end, for me. An ordinary watchful boy, he turned into a keeper of true things by the simple act of handing me a notebook and trusting me with what I saw. I stopped for you just now, by telling it. And somewhere down the road there'll be somebody hidden under a cliff you can't see, and a small hurt thing right in front of you that you can. And you'll remember an old man you never met saying stop for the bird. Every time on faith, and maybe you'll stop. That's the whole of why I wrote this. That's the children I can't see. That's the bigger thing I'm trusting it points at. He's been gone 36 years. I still take my hat off when one goes over.